Hello my dear fans, you're on the Military Summary channel. In this short video we're going to discuss the most important events that took place during the previous night. And we got a lot of updates from the, let's say, the United States of America, and according to information we have, the United States has no funds left for direct budgetary support to Kiev. And this is a very big problem, but first of all, this is something like a media aspect. Anyway, the Ukrainians do have a lot of weapons, do have manpower, they still have possibilities to fight. Maybe the Ukrainians lost possibilities to launch full-scale offensive operations, but to fight in defense they still have power and they still have some time. So we'll see what is going to be next. Interesting updates are coming from the southern part of Ukraine. First of all, I would like to admire that the first F-16s arrived in Romania, and it doesn't mean that this year we're going to see F-16s above the sky of Ukraine, but the sources are saying that in 2024 like NATO instructors will start teaching and learning the Ukrainians to use this machine, and probably in 2024 we're going to see F-16s in Ukraine. Some details we got from Odessa. If you remember, yesterday the Russians attacked the ship. The first ship since the beginning of the trade blockade in this area was attacked by the Russian fleet, by the Russian forces. And the sources are saying that when the ship was damaged, few personnel of the crew were killed and damaged, and the special forces of Ukraine arrived at that place and they occupied this territory and forced the people, the civilians, to leave this area, and they start, let's say, unpacking the ships as fast as possible. So probably the Ukrainians tried to get some weapon or maybe missiles with that ship, but the Russian intelligence worked perfectly. They discovered the situation and attacked this area with missiles or drones. Now we're moving to Kherson direction. We continue receiving a very bad piece of news for the Russians. Today the Ukrainians published more details about their fightings, about their clashes in this area, and there are a lot of very interesting updates. First of all, the Ukrainians published a video how they managed to discover the Ukrainian fuel truck that probably arrived in this area to bring some fuel for Russian vehicles, but as a result of a strike, probably as a result of FPV drone strike, that fuel machine was damaged and the Russian soldiers were wounded or killed. Nothing special happens on this video when talking about vehicles. This is very cheap vehicles, so there is nothing special about the armored vehicles that were destroyed. The important thing is the distance that Ukrainians have, the technologies that Ukrainians have to fly above the Russian territories without any problems, and the distance is around 25 kilometers. And this is a very big distance between Ukrainian positions and the position of Russian fuel truck that was damaged. And we haven't seen any like work of electronic warfare equipment or anti-radars or something like this. The same story we received on the south of Krinky. On the first video we can see how the Russians tried to move their electronic warfare equipment as close as possible to the combat line, but the Ukrainians were tracking this equipment during its movement, and as a result of HIMARS strike, that machine was destroyed. As soon as the Ukrainians managed to suppress the Russian electronic warfare weapons, equipment, they start bombing and destroying artillery systems in this area as well. On this video we can see the D-30 howitzer that was also destroyed, probably as a result of maybe M777 howitzer strike or maybe another HIMARS strike. So if we increase the number of updates since the beginning of this month, we're gonna see that Ukrainians have currently two things they're trying to implement. On the short distance, they're let's say on the settlements along the Dnieper River, they try to suppress and destroy the Russian forces using FPV drones, the Russian positions, infantry. There are bombardments and also radars, communication equipment, so everything that can be reached by the FPV drones they try to destroy in the short distance. It's Oleshki, it's on the south of Pridniprovska, it's positions of Russian forces in Krynki and Korsunka. On a longer, medium distance, the Ukrainians try to suppress the Russian, like larger, bigger electronic warfare equipment and artillery systems. So, as you can see, and as we can see currently, I'm not saying nothing. I'm just trying to analyze the data geolocations we have. The Ukrainians tried and all have almost completely established, let's call it short distance superiority. And based on the videos and geolocations we just received, Ukrainians also tried to establish medium, let's say, range superiority. So everything that's located in the white and blue like areas under Ukrainian control, the first line, white line, is under control FPV drones, and the second line under control of probably more equipped or better like drones, intelligent drones, and HIMARS systems. The Russians are doing the same thing that they did in the previous months. They tried to destroy the Ukrainian forces concentration with FAB bombings and Lancet strikes. Now we are moving to Zaporozhye area. We got also a lot of updates. The Ukrainians, as a result of clashes during the previous weeks, managed to develop some positions on the west of Robotyne, and currently they were trying the previous night, the previous day, to dig in deeper in these positions, trying to bring more infantry, trying to improve their positions in the ex-Russian trenches. And the Russians, of course, saw everything, and during the previous days, the Russians were trying not to allow the Ukrainians to do this by using the FPV drones against the Ukrainian position. So a lot of infantry, a lot of soldiers, a lot of vehicles were destroyed, but no matter the Russian attempts, the Ukrainians managed to dig in deeper and to bring infantry closer to settlements like Koponyno, Prokopovka. Some attacks were implemented by the Russians successfully, some attacks failure, and on this video, for example, we can see how the Russians were trying to evacuate their wounded soldiers under the fire of cluster rounds. So the Ukrainians were bombing, but the Russians, no matter the cluster rounds, tried to evacuate their wounded soldier. Now we are moving to Avdiivka direction. We also got lots of updates during the previous night. The Russians continue the tightening of the Avdiivka news, and we got some geolocations, some updates from the flanks, and the most important ones, of course, are coming from Krasnogorovka. According to the most of the mappers, the Russians managed to improve their positions on the north of this small village. And basically, as a result of offensive operation, as a result of clashes, currently the Russians control this territory. So this square was taken by the Russians, was captured by the Russians, and the most important, that the Russians managed to enter these three lines, these trenches, and now this day, probably before the end of the weekend, they will try to clear this area. Some sources are saying, one more time, there are a lot of speculations that the Russians managed to cross the railways, that the Russians managed to almost enter Stepova, but all those just regular speculations. Currently, the Russians have their positions just along the railways, and the Russians, maybe they're making some reconnaissance in force or reconnaissance in combat attempts to check the Ukrainian positions. But one more time, until the Russians establish control over the every single field that located between the railways, they are not going to attack Stepova and Berdichi. Some video we got from the northern part, from the south of Novokalinova. Also, the Ukrainian sources published the video how they were bombing the Russian infantry in this area, which also confirms some Russian progress and some attempts from the Russian side to concentrate stormtroopers in this area. Maybe the Russians also planning to continue offensive operation, and as I understand, when talking about the northern part of the railways, the Russians during this week or the next week will try to improve their positions either in this direction, and the main purpose of this attack is to meet the Russian forces who are currently trying to develop their positions on the south. So something like this. And as soon as the Russians clear and establish control over these two white clouds, only after this update, after this achievement, the Russians will be able to proceed and continue further. And when talking about timings, of course, all these two fields are not going to be taken, let's say, by the end of this week. Obviously, the Russians need some time. For example, of course, these two operations can be made synchronously. You don't need to make them one by one, step by step. But even though, for example, as I understand, according to raw estimations, to capture this territory, let's add this on map. To capture this territory, obviously the Russians need something around a week. Maybe by the end of this week, the Russians will be able to do this. But to capture the next through line, this one, the Russians gonna need another week. So just according to the raw estimations, up to 2 weeks, the Russians need to improve their positions and to start offensive operation, to start storming the villages like Berdichi and Stepova. On the southern flank, we also have some progress, and currently the Russians are trying to improve their positions and to bypass Severne from two directions, from the western part of the village and from the eastern part. And the Ukrainians always try to counterattack, endless counterattacks, trying to slow down the Russians and not to allow them to encircle the village. So anyway, the clashes continues, and the more and more sources are saying that Ukrainians have a very bad, poor situation. But no matter this, they continue fighting and continue redeployment of forces in this area. On this video, in the vicinity of Novoalexandrovka, we geolocated the Lancet strike against another Ukrainian Bradley that was redeployed in this direction. Furthermore, the Ukrainians realized that the situation is very critical in Avdiivka, and they took a decision to redeploy some operational reserves from Konstantinovka also in direction of Avdiivka. And mainly we are talking about just artillery forces, artillery support. And the Russians, because of that fact that Ukrainians start operating with these reserves, the Russians took a decision to launch their own offensive operation on the south of Bakhmut front line, on the south of Bakhmut area. And the main purpose of these attacks, the Russians are attacking in direction of Andreevka, and the Russians are attacking currently, during the previous night, they were attacking in direction of Klishchevka to force the Ukrainians to keep their artillery forces in Konstantinovka and not to redeploy them in direction of Avdiivka. You see, that's the main problem and the main big fail of the Russian plan to attack Avdiivka. Of course, it's not like you don't have any other option. The Russians don't have any other options. They need to clear Avdiivka, but the best benefit for the Ukrainians is that they can manipulate with reserves easily. They can send reserves, artillery systems to Avdiivka, and then as soon as they manage, let's say, to stabilize the situation, they can send artillery back to Konstantinovka and to start artillery duels with the Russian forces who are trying to attack in the vicinity of Berkhovka water reservoir and Klishchevka, Andreevka. So they're pretty flexible. The Russians had less more problem, but almost the same. But anyway, they need to find a solution. So that's why the Russians start bombing and attacking Andreevka and Klishchevka. And some sources are saying that, and some mappers have already updated the map, that as a result of clashes during the previous night, the previous day, the Russians return control over some positions along the railways. Some Russian sources are saying that the Russians have entered the village Klishchevka, and they managed to dig in deeper for another 200 meters, and that Ukrainians currently, because of the fact that they have removed some reserves from this area, currently are stepping back or withdraw their positions. So today I believe we're going to receive more updates from Klishchevka, but probably the most important update is that the Russians, as a result of clashes, as a result of counter-offensive operation, managed to return completely control over Andreevka. Of course, there are nothing left from that village, just the ruins, but it's also something like a very unpleasant pressure against the Ukrainian forces, and now they need to do something with this. And the only thing they can do is to stop redeployment of reserves to Avdiivka and first to stabilize situation in this area, and only after that stabilization to move there further. And we understand that it's a timing, and the Ukrainians don't have such this time, because as soon as they keep their forces here, the Russians will stop as well. So they need to find a solution, but what kind of solution, I don't know. Also, we got some video from Solidar. The Ukrainian forces managed to discover the Russian local ammo depot, and as a result of strike, they managed to destroy it. Also, we got updates from Spornaya. A week ago, we got update that the Russians managed to capture this village, but today we got some proofs that Ukraine still controls the edge positions of this village, which means that the Russians haven't entered. On this video, we see the Russian bombardment of Ukrainian forces in a temporary position in a stronghold. We don't have the numbers, but we're using this video to confirm that the Russians haven't captured Spornaya, and this village still under control, complete control of Ukrainian forces. We haven't received almost anything from Kupiansk-Liman front line, just a video published by the Ukrainian forces about results of clashes. If you remember, a few weeks ago, there was a Russian very powerful attack from Pershatravnevo in direction of the road that connects Petropavlov-Karlyanka, and as you can see on this video, I can't say that all these armored vehicles were destroyed, but most of them probably were abandoned, and the Russians probably tried to hide among the brushes, among the tree lines and so on. Obviously, this equipment can be evacuated, and after months of in-service center, everything will be fixed, repaired, and returned back to the combat line. So, as you can see, probably the Russians control these brushes that located on the south of this arm. So the tanks are completely correct, as you can see. But anyway, the Ukrainians are showing this video saying about the Russian significant losses. So, and that's it for this short video. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.